If we're losing the ecosystem of the Andean region to silly things like people who are in poverty have to cut down trees to sell them for fire, this seems something that the private sector can solve without having to go into like, don't cut the trees. No, it's about, I want to breathe good air sitting in London. Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia has a very healthy microfinance ecosystem, but our companies were too large for microfinance. And yet they were still too small for regular investment deals. So that's what the missing middle is. When you're doing ecosystem building, you have to lead with trust first, because when you lead with trust, then you build trust, and then you keep bringing on different allies and partners. I think that the most important education I received is by observing and talking and listening, working alongside entrepreneurs that operate these super volatile markets and then just keep going.
Over 83% of you that listen to or watch this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start today? If you like the show and if you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free and simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button or following us on your podcast app. It helps this channel more than you know. Thank you and enjoy this episode. Michelle, it's great to finally connect. Thanks for coming on the show with me today.
Thank you, Scott. I'm very excited to be here.
I've got a lot I want to get to today, but I always start these conversations by going back to the beginning, because I believe who we are is influenced so much by our early environment, and our childhood so often shapes everything. You were born and raised in Quito, Ecuador. Tell me about that and the home environment that you grew up in, and who were your parents and what did they do for work, and what kind of conversations were happening around your family dinner table?
Being born in Quito, being Ecuadorian is a very important part of my identity. So I'm always happy to talk a little bit about that. So I grew up in Quito in, like solidly middle-class family. I think, somebody asked me recently about a very fond memory about my childhood. And we lived in an apartment building, in a small apartment, and my mom had to work sometimes, and she wouldn't really have someone to like leave us with, so she would like always be multitasking and trying to figure out how to get things done. But that left very little time for like trips to the park or really leaving that apartment. That apartment was our entire lives. One Christmas, I think some other extended family members gifted us skates. And of course, for skating, you need to usually get out of an apartment. But actually, my one of my fondest memories was going around this tiny little living room in this apartment, going around the living room over and over again, trying to learn how to skate and holding on to the different furniture and having a blast. And I don't know, I think it's one of those things where, sometimes we have this idea that only abundance will really bring happiness. And I felt very abundant going around in circles in my tiny, middle-class apartment in Quito with my skates. And I would do it for hours, right? That really informed a lot of who I am and understanding, this, like how hard it is to stay middle-class in Latin America. And always knowing that we were always, there was always we were one or two things away from losing that really important status that we had.
I imagine the people who lived in the apartment below you also have memories of you roller skating.
Probably. That's true. I never thought about it.
What did your mother do?
My mom was a preschool teacher. So she was actually a preschool teacher's assistant, and she was the English language assistant. She was never really bilingual, but she knew enough English to teach preschool kids. And that was actually probably one of the most determining facts of where my life ended up going. My mom was very adamant that I become bilingual, that from an early age, I started learning English. I remember we had this VCR with those big cassettes. We had only a couple of English movies because they were hard to come across. I watched Mary Poppins on repeat for a number of summers, and that's how I really learned English. I still know the entire script because that was really how we would really get used to like pronunciations and grammar and how do you use words in different contexts. Being the daughter of a preschool teacher is a good deal.
Was your father present?
Yeah, but not for a long time. He was a civil engineer, and I grew up mostly with my mom's side of the family. So my grandfather was a civil engineer as well. And my uncles were civil engineers. Dinner table conversations were around the price of materials. My grandfather decided to move away from offering services to the government to starting his own business. He had a piece of land and decided to start building low-income housing, which at the time was very progressive and forward-looking. And he was thinking, well, but these people also need to have an asset to be able to, borrow against, right? So maybe their kids will be able to go to university. So yeah, dinner table conversations run around that, run like strategies for selling houses to low-income people. I remember my grandfather, being one of the first people that I heard talking about, doing direct lending. As a small business owner, he realized that a lot of his clients said, oh, we wish we could do it. We have this, our parents are living in Spain legally and, sending us remittances, and we have the income to buy this house. It's just that the banks won't lend us. So he would say, well, let me meet your parents in Spain. They would have a phone call back then, and he would do direct lending, which was incredible. So those are the conversations I grew up around.
You went to the Colegio Americano in Quito for your preparatory schooling. If it's like other international schools, it was a petri dish of cultures. All of my kids went to the International School of Geneva, which I would imagine had some similarities to the Colegio Americano, which is a mixture of expat diplomat kids and foreign assignment gringo kids, along with some wealthy local kids whose family could afford the tuition, and all of them probably with some serious entitlement issues mixed in with genuine curiosity about the world. What did that environment teach you about social classes and culture and opportunity? And how did that bicultural experience shape your worldview?
I was always made very aware of how lucky I was to be in that school, because it was a big effort. The first few years, my mom was still a preschool teacher, so she got a very good deal on sending us to that school. That's where she taught. And then once we were in, it was, there were a few years where it was a patchwork of figuring out how to keep us there. And then it was a patchwork of figuring out different scholarships. I remember then for my last 2 years, it was such a big stretch. And then I was lucky. Like they created this new scholarship that had nothing to do with academics, because I wasn't always the best student. Let's say that. And then they created this other one for leadership. And I got it. And it was just enough to get me over those last 2 years. I was very aware of that. I was also became very aware of understanding how different families live and the expectations that they have of their children. And I'm very grateful for that too. I remember meeting for the first time, the school had a national section, which is where I was at, but my English was good enough to take classes with the international sections, which is where the diplomat kids were. And that's for the first time I heard the concept of a college essay. It was our assignment. And I said, what do you mean? A college essay? And they're like, yeah, you apply to study abroad. And I'm like, what? And it blew my mind, the idea that I could, upon graduation, find a different path. So that also informed a lot and broadened my worldview by 100 times, because I always thought, okay, I graduate from here and I go to my local little university and I'll probably study law or business administration and serve locally here, serve my country here. But yeah, the whole idea of international scholarships and universities who would want me was beyond I ever imagined. So that I'm very grateful for that.
When you think back, did these experiences shape your drive to lead from the global South, or was that something that evolved much later on?
I don't know if it's had a name back then, but yes, I would say that there's a lot of roots there. I think that understanding the efforts that it takes as a family to move forward and to secure development and asset and a future for your children, that has always been in my mind, understanding how to operate frugally in a country like Ecuador that is already considered by most in the world a frontier market. Yes, that definitely came from that upbringing. But also understanding, I think that being that level of risk taker, I think that really came from my grandfather, from him being a civil engineer and being like, well, suppose I'll, build houses and sell them now. Or like, oh, without knowing any better, like, okay, I'll do direct lending. Why not? I mean, he probably didn't have like the financial background or anything like that to really support his business proposition, but also understanding that, he has done well in his life. He's 93 and still works 1 day a week. He followed his instinct always. And then the math and the financials and the spreadsheets followed, because he understood, that behind everything else, really, there is trust, there is hard work, there is character. That has made me a little bit more open to taking risks and maybe just thinking about the regular international standards of how things are supposed to happen according to an MBA student, just being like, yes, that is the reflection of all these other very human experiences that we have.
There's this beautiful story about your grandfather who just have told us a couple things about, and that instead of having a traditional office, he'd welcome home buyers into his living room and celebrate with them when they got their keys to their new house. And that seems like such a human way to do business. What did watching him do this, making such a personal investment in his clients, what did that teach you about the relationship between business and the human connection?
I mean, I think it taught me everything, I think that in the end, I wasn't just observing that. I was a part of it. I was the one, this little girl bringing, he would say, oh, open the best bottle of whiskey. And we only had one, right? Like, but he always made a show. It was like, the best bottle of whiskey, please. So I would just like go and bring the, the little platter with like, hors d'oeuvres and the whiskey. And I would just see them cheer. I think that's, to me, that was more than just a celebration of their home. It was just like them welcoming. This is a civil engineer, which is like, has a status in this culture, welcoming, this family into an entire new chapter in their lives and for them and for their children. And thinking about transactions, like a business transaction, like, you could consider it a real estate transaction as far more than that, and understanding that there is value beyond, the brick and mortar that you're selling. That was definitely what informed how I approached later on in my life opening the first network of co-working spaces here in Ecuador, because people would come and say, some people would come with this reductionist attitude. Okay, this is a square meter. Why are you charging me 10 times? I'm like, well, because that's not what you're buying. You're buying community, you're buying, a sense of belonging. You're buying so much more, and that has value. And if it doesn't have value to you, that's fine. But those who stick around and have helped us grow completely understand the value of intangibles in intangibles and the human side to doing business.
This having your eyes open at the Colegio Americano about studying, and then when you graduated, made the decision to study political science and human rights at St. Thomas University in Canada. That's quite a specific focus for someone that young. Tell me, why Canada? What was driving that choice of studies? And were you already thinking about justice and systems change? Or was that passion that developed over time?
Well, you know what? I think I was. I think I was already thinking about systemic change. I mean, to offer you some context, when I was 16, 17, was a period of time when Ecuador went through something like 3 different presidents and topplings, right? Like a lot of political instability in this country. The year before I graduated, or actually it was the year I was about to graduate, we went from our national currency, the sucre, to the US dollar. And, the dollarization of the economy, right now you can say it was probably good in the long term. But, the brutal somewhat inhumane social effects of that, will always be in my mind. It was my instinct to study political science because in my mind, it was the politics that was affecting all of our lives, right? I saw the bank where my grandfather had been placing all of his savings completely shut down and take them all away. Right? And we had like a financial crisis in 99. And that's why he still works today, 93. Like, so those effects are long lasting. So in my mind, it was just like, okay, politics, that's gotta be the solution. And then the human rights side had something to do with maybe like, I did model United Nations that was my sport. It was always really interesting to me to understand human rights and like why and how can you really support people that way. Yeah, but it was very specific. I was always that type of quirky kid, but my grandfather still didn't understand why on earth would I move to Canada to study these. I had a full scholarship to attend. That was what got me out of the country and made my family take this leap and be like, okay, you're 17, you're moving on your own. I guess we can't say no because I had a full scholarship. That really was an important part of my moving away too. Beyond the specifics of what I was studying, I think taking that leap of going to a country where I had never experienced even winter before, that, I would say that was probably the biggest leap.
I've worked a lot of places in Latin America, but not Ecuador. When you talked about transitioning to the dollarization of the economy, was that the usual Latin American step function where you just go overnight?
Nobody was told.
You're told the day after.
Yeah, exactly. And then, that day, yeah, we're told the day after. And I remember cab drivers going into a huge protest and blocking all streets. So I remember very clearly my father, I mean, he didn't have a lot of savings, but he had some. And he had to borrow a neighbor's bicycle to get to the actual bank building, which makes no sense, right? Nobody was there, just to bang on it and just get it out of his system, right? Like, it was very unnerving, understanding that systems can fall so easy. But there's the flip side of that is understanding that systems can fall so easy means that systemic change is possible.
You graduated from undergraduate university around 2004, and then you immediately dove into graduate school.
I went to the University of Oxford, straight from graduation, to do a master's in human rights law. What ended up happening is that when I was graduating from university, I was very much in love with my husband, and he was also very in love with me. And then the university invited him to apply for this program. And our university was small, liberal arts, not necessarily well recognized across the country, but well known in the humanities. And they said, "Oh, Matt, you study literature, you're smart enough, you do some baseball. Why don't you apply for the Rhodes Scholarship?" Long story short, he gets it. And when he gets it, he says, "I don't think I can take this because Michelle can't come. She would need a visa, or she wouldn't have to study there." Longer story short, we get married before I graduate university so that we can move together to Oxford. So that was the plan. I would go as the wife. And yet I did apply for a very competitive program that only really was built for lawyers, for practicing lawyers. I was not one. I got accepted as probably one of the 2 non-lawyers in the program. And my grandfather, calls in the day of my graduation when I received this acceptance letter. And he says, "Well, I had this piece of land for when someday you will get married and you will build your home there and, grow your family. But I think this is a better plan. I think that giving you the gift of equality with your husband is more important. So I've sold this land and you can now pay for this degree that you've been accepted to." So that was also another big leap, because for my husband and I, it was just going from, a very small, somewhat rural part in Canada to our entire world being, in front of us, and just all of a sudden the world was our oyster. That's what led me to Geneva and working in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom around, human rights and gender rights. There is another big leap in my life that happened there that makes me feel very fortunate for how things worked out.
What did you study at Oxford?
It's a Master of Studies in International Human Rights Law. So it's the equivalent of an LLM.
From Oxford, you went to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom from there.
Yeah, but I actually only spent less than a year there, because then our entire plan was to move back to Ecuador.
And then you moved into Ecuador's Ministry of Foreign Affairs as refugee claims adjudicator.
At that time, Ecuador was the recipient of the largest number of refugees in the continent. And that was the end of Plan Colombia, a very violent time in Colombia, mostly rural, vulnerable populations affected. So Ecuador needed all of a sudden to have an asylum adjudication claims system, which we didn't, because who wants to come to Ecuador, right? Apparently Colombians that are in distress. So yeah, I came right on time. It was a time when they really needed an Ecuadorian, someone who would also understand the dynamics of xenophobia, which also happen, across South to South borders, and help set up that administrative system. And then soon after I left that, because I was like, okay, well, we created the state, now with a good Oxford education, I realized that we've created a strong state side process. So that means we need a strong civil society process for checks and balances. And there was none. So we created the first legal asylum clinic of the country. It was interesting to be operating in such a space, because again, it was a space where there was nothing. And then we had to create systems and operate them and uphold rules and have, ethical standards throughout. And at that time, I was 24, 25, already setting up these big processes that were determining the lives of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. It was a really great first hands-on experience post graduating.
You also founded Asylum Access in Ecuador, or was that one and part of the
that's what
same
it is.
thing?
Yeah. So when I mentioned this, like the first legal aid clinic for refugees, that's Asylum Access. So it came from the fact that in the global north, because of course, the stakes are higher about getting refugee status, you have lots of asylum clinics, right? Like a lot of people that offer their time pro bono to support refugees. We needed the same thing, but, an Ecuador version where the stakes are lower, the process is simpler, but there's still a lot of opportunities for abuse, opportunities for mistakes, opportunities for appeals. That's why we created Asylum Access. And, it was interesting because in my mind, we were just kind of like doing this legal, very niche human rightsy thing. But we had demands upon this legal clinic to take more and more clients. The more I started realizing that my mind, as much as I studied law, was actually more around problem solving and like figuring out how to innovate to make things more efficient. Also coming at this from a perspective that my grandfather would have had is like, okay, what are my clients? Where do people who are, the most vulnerable refugees here? Okay, they don't stand first in line for the papers. They're probably around the corner. So we actually would go and find, the places where they would hang out, give them pamphlets, being very empathetic to understand what is it that they need. And then also empathetic to our funders. Our funders were like, well, I don't think you're seeing enough people. I'm like, okay, hold my beer. So we would, make things more efficient and when we broke out the entire asylum support process into different parts. And then we turned the ones that could be collective and not private into large collective know your rights training so that our lawyers could do a lot of these like little interventions. I'm probably geeking out too much about that, but the resulting system was so good that the US State Department learned that by investing far less than what they thought in getting people their documentation in Ecuador, they could actually get them the right to work legally instead of having to buy the usual, humanitarian package of like bags of rice, here's your tent, these are fully able-bodied people that wanted to work. They couldn't because they needed their documentation. It was great because once the US State Department learned about this, they actually supported us to scale it worldwide, to Thailand, to Tanzania. And that brought me right back out of Ecuador again, scaling, this homegrown innovation in Ecuador out to other places. We did learn from other colleagues in Kenya and in Egypt as well. And I think that having come from the Oxford side just made it easier for me to imagine that there could be this south to south learning. That made it a lot easier.
Around 2008, you decided you needed more education and you went to UC Berkeley for your Master of Public Policy. So what was the moment or realization that made you think, I need to go back to school?
I don't think I thought I needed to go back to school, but I definitely realized that, the more asylum access grew and the more we thought about it growing, that the legal preparation that I had was not going to be enough, that I needed some administrative skills, right? To really understand. And I think that at that time, business was so far from my horizon that the next closest thing, I was just like, okay, public policy, it's like administration, but for public things. So let's do public policy. I really don't think I thought about it too much. It was a very special scholarship that I got to go to UC Berkeley where the Rotary Foundation found people that were working on the front lines and they figured people who might have needed help in taking that career break. I was still so young, but I already needed a career break. Working with refugees is no joke. Like, this is really difficult. This touches upon your belief in humanity versus, hope and fears and trauma and vicarious trauma. I was needing a break. And then thinking, okay, maybe I could still help, but not on the front lines. Maybe I could be the person thinking about the bigger, public policy issues. That's what made me apply for the Rotary Foundation. And then they would give you the full scholarship first. And then they would ask you to pick what you wanted to study. which was a good deal. So that's when I was just like, looked, I'm like, I don't know. Public policy, why not? Ended up being very hard.
About 2010, you went back to Asylum Access as the overseas operation director. You founded the Ecuadorian office, right?
Which was also the first one. I mean, it had this idea of becoming international, but we were the first pilot.
That's amazing. When you became the overseas operation director, you were managing teams in Ecuador and Thailand and Tanzania. Did you do that from Quito, or is that when you went to Geneva?
So the first year of that, I actually was working from San Francisco. After UC Berkeley, stayed on for another year in San Francisco. And then we realized that the commute was a little too long in San Francisco, as the time zone wasn't the best to work with Thailand and Tanzania, which were our two new growing offices. So I moved to Geneva when my husband got a job there. I'm like, okay, that's perfect. Better time zone, closer to the UN. So then I spent another couple of years there. That was amazing because it was a great way of, again, we were such a small, scrappy organization. We're like, why not? Of course, that's how we're going to scale this organization. And it worked, small but mighty. We were like a little bit like, acupuncture within that system, because we were building quality legal services in places where it would, where you would think that's higher up the Maslow pyramid of needs. And we were redefining that. We're like, no, rights, your basic human rights and your documentation is at the very bottom, because that's what gets you food. That's what gets you water. That's what gets you, And it was really beautiful to be able to see the ripple effects of our existence, just our mere existence and operations, making people think differently at the United Nations level, at the humanitarian, policy level, thinking, okay, well, yeah, actually, maybe you're right. Maybe we don't need to just feed them first. Yes, of course, we need to get them up and running, but it's so important to give them their rights. Yeah, it was a different time.
And then about 3 years later, 2013, and you make a very big change and you leave an established career at that point in Geneva. You sell everything you own, move back to Ecuador with some vague notion of starting a social business. A lot of people might call that career suicide. What was your internal calculation at that point?
There were a couple of things that happened. When we lived in Geneva, we had a dog. Okay, I know this seems silly, but bear with me. She was like our sense of home and care and everything that is beautiful about the world, because she was so small and cute, and she had cancer and passed, unfortunately. And it was one of those things that that is very personal to you in your life. It just makes you think, okay, what am I really doing? One. And two, I started coming up against the limits of advocacy, and I realized that maybe advocacy without power building isn't quite enough, right? And at that time, all of this, we have words to explain, and, the phenomenon of colonial thinking and bias and all these. At that time, I was just like, okay, I'm keep hitting this invisible, wall. I don't know what it is, but my instinct was just that that this sector is probably not where I'm going to find it. And I had heard about social businesses from a couple of courses that I took at UC Berkeley. I would be the policy student taking the MBA courses by the end of it and understanding. And I was always so intrigued by what can be done as a business if you were a business for good. Because in our mind, it was always civil society sector, usually companies, as a child of the 90s, companies are the evil. Corporations were evil, right? So in my mind, I could never imagine working, even being friends with someone in a corporation, right? That it was this internal fight. But then I realized, okay, business can be used for good. Okay, maybe we could actually change more things. Oh, wow, the business sector is a lot larger than the civil society sector. Maybe we could make systemic change. So I moved back to Ecuador with this desire to build tools and not just critique systems. And, and this pivot from policy to innovation was not really a betrayal of my values. I didn't see it as that. It was actually a better fulfillment of them. Founding IMPAQTO, this company that I ended up founding, was just my way of asking, what if the global South didn't wait for capital to trickle down? What if we just built our own ladders? What if we built our own set of solutions? And thinking about the private sector seemed like an endless place of possibilities, whereas in this nonprofit sector, there are very established ways. It was a sector that was not as open to innovation as the private sector as well.
You made this decision in Geneva, so you just stopped what you're doing there. and moved back to Quito without any
Sold everything.
job, or you didn't
Yeah.
really know. You just had this calling, right?
Yes.
You went through a period where you met your co-founder, Daniela. You were both struggling with loneliness, trying to build something meaningful. And this led to your 100 coffees phase. Tell me about the 100 coffees phase.
First of all, I came back with these big ideas about how we might start a social business. What is this, And this was like impact businesses, social businesses, Mohammed Yunus, all of these big personalities in the impact business space were starting to become mainstream. In my mind, they were mainstream enough, clearly had not reached this region. So every person that I spoke to about this, met me with this blank stare of like, I have no clue what you're talking about. This was also not a period that politically in Latin America, it was very polarizing, right? It was like another set of the 70s were either left or right, you're good or you're bad. So talking about social businesses was just like my way of short circuiting people's minds, because business, which is supposed to be, right winged, that does social good, which is supposed to be left wing, was just like, the epitome of like something that shouldn't exist in this context. So I felt really lonely, and I was just like, okay, I wonder if there's more people in the middle. And that's how I met my co-founder, and that's how we decided, okay, to make a list from, at that time, newspapers were still working towards getting to be online, but most of them weren't. But there was these like magazines that were like business magazines that would report on small businesses that were starting, things that were inspirational. And we would go through them and then find like great businesses that we thought were doing good for the world, that were what we would call a green business, or people who were really, I don't know, going out of their way to do good with business. And we started calling them, every one of them, and invite them to coffee. So that's our 100 coffees phase. We wanted to understand what were their pains. And their pains were very much the same as ours, and even more, like I always say, people say, oh, you went to, to these very top ranked universities. I mean, I like to say, well, my real education came from listening to Ecuadorian entrepreneurs explain why they can't grow. Because when you really have those 100 coffees, I was very caffeinated, and really like invite them to like bear their pains, that was beautiful, because they would never bear a pain. They would never say like, this is so difficult, without it almost in the same sentence, with the same breath saying, but look at what we have here. Look out the window. Like, do you see those mountains? Do you see the potential of the fertility of this land? Like, it would never be this despairing pain. It would always be a pain combined with a hope. And I think that type of education about resilience just can't be beat.
You were lonely because you felt like you were the only one who was thinking like that or discussing this. And by having all these conversations, you found out that actually all these entrepreneurs were also lonely. You concluded that the loneliness among change makers was actually a bigger problem than what you all originally thought you were setting out to solve.
Yeah, well, yeah, my original company was actually supposed to be a social business company. I wanted to replicate and study what my grandfather did to build that out. I may still someday do it. But because I was met with a blank stare, I realized that this is a bigger opportunity. And, it was interesting because we were so in love with that, like with the problem. We didn't even understand where the solution is going to be. We didn't want to plug anything else. So after the 100 coffees phase, we started doing, again, not a business person. I didn't know about market studies. So we decided to continue a different version of this by prototyping. I had understood a little bit about design thinking and the importance of prototyping. So we prototyped what it would look like for us to be together and do this more collectively. So we would do these events that were what we called it community events in restaurants that were closed Monday. So we would ask the restaurant to lend us their closed space in exchange for promoting their restaurant, and they were always like, hey, they said yes. So it was like no cost to us, great infrastructure in the downtown Quito. And we were able to start doing these. And then 9 months later, after really holding these and them growing and people calling each other and pulling new friends into this community, I think the community just came back to us and like, okay, this is wonderful, but we need to now ask you to drink your own Kool-Aid. When are you going to turn this into a business? And we said, what do you mean? And like, well, create something permanent. And I had heard about co-working spaces both in San Francisco and in Geneva at that time. And I said, well, I've heard about this. This sounds like a good idea. Why don't we rent a place and turn it into a permanent community space? When I lived in California, I lived in Oakland, and I loved seeing those community spaces, for the elderly, for children. And I was just thinking like, well, this is well attended. There is demand for this, even if people don't pay, but there's demand for this, value. Why don't we try it out? So we started it, and one space led to five. The companies grew.
That was the start of IMPAQTO. It started as Ecuador's first impact-focused co-working space. I'm always curious about the name. How did you come up with IMPAQTO, which is spelled with a Q instead of the traditional C? How did you arrive at that? What's the story behind the name and spelling of it?
There isn't a lot to it. We had, within our community, there were two entrepreneurs. One entrepreneur that did these beautiful things with indigenous textiles from the north of Ecuador. And her boyfriend was this Cuban designer. And they would always hang out around us. And we asked him, like, hey, what if we gave you, no capital here, right? So it was all trade. Like, what if we gave you free co-working space in exchange for you designing our logo, because we're going to have to put up a sign soon because people can't find us. And he just came up with it because he's brilliant. He's actually gone on to being a very well-known designer in Miami. But at that time, he just put something together and we loved it. And he just said, well, you're called, like, you talk about impact, and you're in Quito, and Quito is your space, and QTO. Why don't we just merge it together? And it was actually, our name was originally just a logo, IMPAQTO. And then eventually it caught on. Like, people just understand that IMPAQTO and is spelled like that, but the people that are from Quito read Quito into it. And so it has a little bit of this hint of localization. And even though we're now a more regional actor, people in Quito see themselves in it. And the people that don't really associate it with Quito just think of it as, as impact in Spanish, as the word. Yeah.
IMPAQTO has evolved far beyond these original co-working roots that you just talked about. So why don't you just paint a high-level picture of IMPAQTO today and walk me through how it evolved into a regional ecosystem builder, and give listeners the 10,000 meter view of IMPAQTO Capital, which is a fund.
It's almost like life took on a completely different rate of change, right? Because once we had the space, it's like something unlocked. I always say to people that are like doing things that are very intangible, where the value is very intangible, to find some tangibility to it. So the fact that our spaces are inspirational and welcome people physically as humans, I think, was one of the most important unlocking elements for everything else we did after. Because once we had humans there sharing a space, they also had this opportunity to share all these other challenges. So we realized, for example, that entrepreneurs had no access to entrepreneurship education. That if you wanted to learn how to run your business, you would have to sign up to either a 4-year business administration university career or a 2-year MBA. They had no other options. So we decided, okay, well, what don't we just started like an entrepreneurship education company on top of this? We have the space, right? So we can turn our shared meeting room for 16 people into, we take out the boardroom table, and then turn it into a 20-person entrepreneurship education business. And again, it caught like wildfire, like, making phone calls. I had to make a lot of phone calls with a lot of people that I had met that were doing impact business accelerators, impact business incubators. We had this great connection with a university in Vancouver, for example, that was able to lend us their methodology, and then called on other people in the Unreasonable Institute in the United States. And then they gave us a bunch of, of material that we could then learn and then teach. So it's interesting because IMPAQTO was a startup, an impact startup. And we were only one step ahead of the people we were teaching. And what that meant is that we were able to really understand how to build curriculum for them. And not just curriculum, but also curriculum design, right? Like we had a lot of, not a lot, but we had at least 3 different female entrepreneurs that really didn't have any place to leave their kids. So we had created another office where the kids could like play and do their homework while they would attend the classes. Things that are very small that seem like, that like seem meaningless ended up being our stamp of, wow, these people do incredible. And very soon thereafter, we had a lot of, just kind of like things that are done with care, just attract investors, attract allies. So by, maybe a year and a half later, we already had attracted a real estate investor that came on board and helped us build out our different, first of all, a larger co-working space, which we outgrew within 6 months and had to expand it by 3 times again. Then we were able to attract the Inter-American Development Bank, which usually funds, they would, at that time, they were only funding, organizations that had at least 5 years of experience and they were only nonprofit. And then when they saw our results with entrepreneurship education, they said, well, okay, we're going to change our eligibility requirements for you. You are a business, you are small, but you're getting the results here and you're hungry for it. So then they funded IMPAQTO Labs. IMPAQTO Labs is the entrepreneurship education company. And then soon after, large corporations, they were like, give me some of this. All of these people are coming out of this. They're so agile and innovating. How can we connect better with these young innovators? Because, in-house, we're not innovating at all or enough or fast enough. So we created IMPAQTO Consulting, which was this like corporate venturing type of business. So IMPAQTO very quickly grew. And by year 9, we were already like a decent holding company with a team of about, between 30 and 32 people the year I left, with 5 co-working spaces and very, like a very important footprint in the region. Because by year 9, we had already survived the pandemic. So the pandemic turned us into an important regional actor, because then all of a sudden this physical space didn't matter.
What is your geographic footprint?
So right now we're well connected, mostly in the Andean region, and that's where we decided to stop, our reach. We do have some good connections in Chile, Argentina, but the Andean region is most often thought of as Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia.
Let's talk about the missing middle capital gap that IMPAQTO is focused on. And for listeners who aren't familiar with this, what exactly do you mean by the missing middle, and why is this segment overlooked by traditional capital markets?
To tie it up a little bit with, our journey as this holding company that did things with entrepreneurs and offered different services, meant that we eventually had great companies that were growing through our programs that needed more than us, that needed actual capital, right? Shoestring is good, but there is a moment where you just really need to access capital. And our first instinct was, well, why don't we just create this event, this event that happens every year, to bring investors from all over the world to get to discover this incredible work that we're doing. So we did that. It was a very successful event. So many people came and curious. And then in this first meetup, we discovered that there was a big mismatch in sizes of tickets. That's actually the biggest mismatch, because the investors would say to us, I would love to invest in this if only it was in Mexico. The market is bigger. We could really do more. Or I would invest here, but really the levels of revenue don't really match up with their level of sophistication. It's a sophisticated company, but the revenue is small. Why? Because this is a small market. So we realized that we're not going to be able to bring these international investors to invest in here. We probably needed a homegrown solution. We were able to find out what the name of our problem was, which is this missing middle of finance problem, which basically happens when you have a lot of capital. Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia has a very healthy microfinance ecosystem. But our companies were too large for microfinance. Their potential was far too large for microfinance. And yet they were still too small for regular investment and impact investment, deals. Actually, in some cases, probably the right size for a commercial bank loan, but they did not have collateral. Most of them were, companies that don't really have a lot of guarantee to offer. And also the interest rates were not great because these are built for companies that are larger. They would like barely make it, but really most of these bank loans are for that. So that's what the missing middle is. It's this entire middle of finance where there is a lack of capital flowing into these companies. And what happens when you have a missing middle problem is that the entire ecosystem suffers, because then down the line we would have the regular banks saying, oh, there's not enough small and medium businesses to invest in. Oh, well, we'll keep investing in the larger ones, right? And then the moment where this financial gap, like a market failure of the financial market gap turns into a social problem, is that it is actually creating a smaller middle class, right? So because nobody is attending to these, to these potential businesses, and everyone has the incentive to go either lower or higher, you end up, having this this middle class, like I said, that continues to struggle to stay there. And the pull to the bottom is higher, it's stronger than the pull to the upper level. I don't know if I'm expressing myself there, because I'm a very graphic person. I have this graph very clearly in my mind where you have this gap and it keeps getting bigger and our democracies keep falling and polarization keeps, festering, and all because the middle class cannot sustain itself, right? And it keeps shrinking. So yes, thinking about this again, systemically, we said, well, why not? Why don't we create a fund? And then that's when I realized that creating the first impact investment fund for the missing middle in Latin America would require more time for me. And that's when I decided to step down as the CEO of the other holding company of Impacto, the mother company, and we created IMPAQTO Capital as a spin-off. Also partly because we were able to have the incredible fortune to have my co-founder in IMPAQTO Capital, Justin Schwartz, there ready to also pursue this dream. Right. So Justin is a Californian, financial professional who saw the light at some point, after working in private equity for a long time, went to Sierra Leone to work with Kiva on microfinance, and then knew that he wanted to work in impact investing in a frontier market. Ecuador felt like a better possibility than Sierra Leone as a frontier market. So we had him here ready. At that time, he was leading our accelerator program. So our own intrapreneurs, and decided to launch IMPAQTO Capital to solve that.
So that was 2021. So you started IMPAQTO around 2013. So now you no longer leading the IMPAQTO, you're more dedicated to IMPAQTO Capital?
That's right. I'm still a shareholder, of course. I will always be the co-founder, But yeah, IMPAQTO, the mother company with, the holding of, the smaller business units. Yeah, it runs on its own. It's doing really well. My co-founder, Dani, she's one of the co-CEOs there. So it's held up really well. And now my focus is IMPAQTO Capital.
At IMPAQTO Capital, you describe your investment philosophy as using capital as a system redesign tool. Now, that's a powerful way to think about money. What does that actually mean in practice?
Maybe I can give you an example of what it means in practice. We can get into the mechanics of it as well, but I think it's about the root of how we were able to fundraise, right? So to set the scene, 2021, middle of the pandemic, Justin goes, it's now or never. And I'm like, okay, let's give it a go. Like, why not? The first people that we presented IMPAQTO Capital to were actually a number of businessmen in Cuenca, which is a southern city in Ecuador, not even Quito, in Cuenca. These are, Cuenca, it's a very prosperous city, has a lot of incredible business leaders that tend to be very inward looking. They always invest in their city, and their city is what's most important. And it tends to be like family groups as well, right? So speaking to patriarchs, right, turned out to be a far better match for impact investing than to, regular finance people out here in Quito. Because when we were explaining what we were doing, they immediately understood that we were trying to move capital not from the future we predict, but the future we want to build. And that is already the way they invest. Cuenca, for all you know, is a southern city in Ecuador. You wouldn't think, it doesn't have like easy access to a port. They have manufacturing galore. If they were thinking, okay, we want to like reduce costs and be very competitive, they would take that money, I don't know, bring it to China and do manufacturing there. But they've already like decided that this is the place where they're happy and they want to live. This is their land. So they're going to invest in manufacturing there, and not just one, but an entire collectivity and community of people invest in the future they want to build there. So once they understood that, they're like, okay, you understand me, I understand you, we're in. And all of a sudden we had a number of our first LPs were local business people. And when we brought this to more institutional investors that were thinking, okay, you're a first-time fund manager, your fund is quirky, it's a geography that no one has ever tried. The moment we said, oh, but local people believe in us, they were like, okay, we're in. Because they understood that all this perceived risk would immediately go down when local business people that understand how to operate locally were in, and they were part of, a part of de-risking that investment. So that is a little bit of how we were thinking about it as a system redesign tool.
Were you intentional by going to local families and businesses for funding first, or you went first to the usual suspects, as we say, Silicon Valley firms or European private equity firms, and they just said like, no, Ecuador, no?
No, we actually went local first. We didn't even know. I mean, it was like it was actually an accidental good strategy. This is it. We're first-time fund managers. We don't understand what the mechanics of raising from LPs are and how do you meet them? Where do you meet them? Like we just had to ask a lot of people. We had a whole other round of 100 virtual coffees with people who were trying to guide us through how to do it. But our instinct was, okay, let's talk to people who understand this first, who already put in their money in this geography, because that's what we thought would be, our biggest hurdle, really understanding why this geography, why is nobody else here? And it turned out it's because nobody had tried it before.
But I have to imagine that when you first started pitching the fund to local business families in Ecuador, yes, they know the region, but I'm sure that when you start talking about impact and things like that, this was a new concept, no?
Yes, actually, we foresaw that. And our biggest fear was that if we used the word impact as the forefront, that they would be like, oh, no. They would go into this, two-pocket mentality, right? Where when people who are wealthy have two pockets, one is for business and one is for philanthropy, that they would put us into the philanthropy pocket. And that was our biggest fear. So, we would talk about the fund and the interest in this geography. And then, of course, all of our examples of potential companies that we would invest in were examples of companies that did really well and that had a great narrative around impact. But we wouldn't say we're investing because of the impact. We would actually lead with how good of a business opportunity this is, because we are looking for healthy returns. That strategy worked. We completely understood that, in this context, it's still a little hard for people to understand that impact can be concessionary, but it doesn't have to be.
I believe that gender lens investing is core to your strategy. So in the Latin American context or the Andean region specifically, what does that look like operationally, and why is it so crucial to your mission?
It is core to what we do. It's not what we lead with. This is not a gender lens fund. This is a fund, that we already have so many fronts of things we need to prove, right? And yet, I think that from all my experience, I would say now it's like we're going on 11, 12 years of being in the private sector. I've always known that gender equity is just good business. We're approaching it from that perspective. We found these incredible, let's call it recipe books, that from 2X Global. 2X Global is, it publishes these frameworks about how to have like a 2X certification, meaning that you use gender lens when you do investing. And what we loved about it is that it just made it simple, because sometimes when people say gender, like things start becoming overwhelming. For me, it does. It's just like, oh, what do you mean gender? But does that mean we invest only in women? But what if this is better? They actually make it very easy, right? So what we do with the 2X framework within IMPAQTO Capital is that from start to finish, we have gender lens investing as a framework. So at sourcing, we intentionally seek out women-led businesses and ventures that serve women and girls. They could be male-led. They could be robot-led. But if they actually serve women and girls specifically or benefit more women and girls, then okay, at sourcing, they have those two extra checks because we need to make sure that our pipeline at the very beginning, when we have 650 at the beginning of the funnel, that a good half of those either are led by women or serve women and girls. Then at the due diligence moments, we assess gender equity in ownership, in leadership, in employment practices, or in product impact as well. Sometimes, the way they design, is actually interesting and serving women in a better way. And of course, within our own fund leadership and our governance, we want to make sure that we always have gender diversity and that we actively encourage portfolio companies to adopt inclusive governance practices. And, and just anecdotally, for example, when we were looking for LPs, notice I mentioned that we had a lot of businessmen who originally invested and who were local. We wanted business women as well. And what we found is, for a number of historical reasons, women are less likely to think of themselves as investors. Even if they've been incredibly successful businesswomen, they don't think of themselves as investors. And we had to do additional extra work. We found really interesting courses about how to empower yourself as an investor. How do you reconfigure your identity to think yourself as an investor? And then when they were ready to say yes, we still created an exception for the minimum ticket price to even bring those women in. Or like, okay, if this is too much risk for you at this number, let's lower it a little bit more, but please come in. We want you to have the experience of being an LP because it is that much more important for all the other funds that you're going to fund in the future. I mean, as a fund, we do carry that additional layer of being the first in so many other things, right?
You just described your fundraising strategy as pursuing lots of local checks, rather than trying to land a few large international commitments. How does this approach change the relationship dynamics with your portfolio companies? What does it teach first-time impact investors?
The approach, I think that at this point, I think that the most important element that this brings is, that there's just so much more trust, right? So there's a saying in Ecuador that's just like, the rooster remembers when they were chickens, right? Businessmen and women that have built out successful businesses in frontier markets in the Andean region that are highly volatile, that you have to deal with everything, anywhere from rolling blackouts to indigenous uprisings, and you just power through. Like, this is how you do it. They also remember when they were smaller and they had to deal with the same things, but with fewer resources. And they also understand that people will come through. So they're not scared easily. So that trust aspect allows us to take on maybe a more adequate, I wouldn't say additional, a more adequate amount of risk with these companies. And then for the companies themselves, I think it's always nice, they call us in like, hey, do you know someone in Colombia, that might, be able to point me to someone, to solve this problem. And, we can actually, we are a very traditional fund in many ways, like an equity-based fund. But in practice, we operate like an angel investors club too, right? That's not to say that we don't have some incredible, larger institutional funds that I believed in us, after that came on board after the first LPs came on board. The Sorensen Impact Fund, they came on board. We have this great LP boosting opportunities. We even have the Untours Foundation, that has started doing some investing, as well. Like, they actually know that they're investing in something far larger than just this fund when they come on board, because we are moving so many of the other levers of these ecosystem to move forward.
Why don't you give me an overview of your investment process? Start with, how do you source your deal flow and what kind of screens do you apply, both financial and impact? And then how do you ultimately get to the investment decision to pull the trigger on a deal?
We take it very seriously, mostly because we understand that, as a fund manager, we're basically a broker, right? And, our investments are only as good as our pipeline, and our funnel is only as good as the efforts that we make to find the absolute best deals. So within that process, I think that there's two levels. One is something that we definitely leverage because our parent company is IMPAQTO. We're already at the center of the ecosystem. So it's not like we have to go out and knock on doors. We have 5 co-working spaces to which anyone who's anyone will set foot on at some point or another, right? At least in this world. So that gives us, a leg up, and it is very easy to get those people, everyone in the larger IMPAQTO family understands when they see a really good business that is coming up, is up and coming, or is growing, they immediately refer those names to us. So Impacto does source a lot, not just from our accelerator, but from everywhere else, just from people that are coming through. We also have a really good network of other accelerators. So of course, the Andean region is no longer this place that doesn't even appear in a map. Now there's all these incredible new programs, accelerators, university programs, all of them having demo days. Some of them are impact, some of them are not, but we attend all of them. And thank God that in the pandemic, all of these demo days started becoming virtual because now we can attend all of them. And it's interesting that you were asking about, at what point do we bring impact into the fold? I think that we do have that instinct that if the company has the potential to become impactful, we would usually have the conversation, so there are fintechs that because of the way they work, if they focus a little bit more on the base of the pyramid, then we will have an incredible impact company with us. So we would talk to the founder to gauge whether or not this is where the founder wants to take it or not. And sometimes the founders are, have a different dream of going to Silicon Valley and serving, upper class people. That's fine. But we always try as well. But then we have the run of the mill, solid companies that have grown despite all odds, that are having incredible impact. When we find them, they already are considering, what their growth strategy has been. Most of them tend to be bootstrapped, but sometimes we get referred companies from other funds as well that, they would like to see them grow. So we're fulfilling our missing middle mandate when they say, okay, if they could grow a little bit more and come back to me in 2 years, that would be great. Why don't you support them? So we become your downstream investor. That also happens as well. We are very intentional about making sure that our funnel is representative of all Indian region countries. We have a quota specifically that our analyst needs to meet. And then when we get to the very end of the funnel, then we usually have 2 or 3 conversations before presenting a memo to our IC where we explain to them our intent of going into due diligence. So if the IC is all squared up on that, and we've actually had 2 or 3 turned down, I don't know what the rate is compared to others, but those 2 or 3 were like, okay, you're right. And we're glad that the investment committee flag this for us. Then we go into our deeper due diligence. And with that, we're able to leverage some support that we have both from Impacto, from partnerships, but also some funding that we have received from the Inter-American Development Bank. They offered us some grants to support the creation of the fund, the legal fees, and then some services that are more related to legal due diligence. Then we have a really good, very strong team, between our analysts and Justin, they will go through those finances very closely. And because ours is a revenue-based finance model, we know exactly what we're looking for. Not every company will be a good fit. Sometimes we don't know until we've really looked through those finances.
Michelle, you've done something that's unique. You've rejected traditional venture capital structures in favor of a revenue-based financing. Now, most early stage funds default to you taking equity stakes in companies. You don't. You do this revenue sharing. Explain to me how revenue-based financing works and tell me, why did you choose revenue sharing versus equity investments? And explain what specific advantages this revenue-based financing provides to your founders that equity structures cannot deliver.
When we were looking at different models of financing and understanding why is it that there's such a big mismatch between the type of capital that existed and the type of companies we have in the region, we realized that we very quickly crossed out the option of having a unicorn chasing VC model because that was not the reality on the ground. That's not to say that there aren't some great tech, B2B SaaS companies in the Andean region that should receive unicorn chasing VC funding, but that's not the case for our pipeline. It doesn't serve our entrepreneurs, and of course, it doesn't serve our impact goals either. So then we realized that revenue share fits the cash flow realities of these smaller businesses and respect their autonomy and reinforces the sustainability. Going back to adding the very human element of doing business with someone, if I'm going to invite them into my living room and offer them, the keys to their new capital, they need to understand that if we were taking equity on them, they're promising to either sell it, or find some other way to exit. It's so interesting to realize that so many startup founders do not realize that, and that prefer equity because it feels cheaper or somewhat easier, when in reality it's, you're signing off a piece of the company that you've built with so much love and care. And for these profile of companies, it's very rare that any of them would actually be ever thinking of an exit. So, I wouldn't consider revenue-based finance as alternative finance. I think it's appropriate finance. So in markets with limited exit options, revenue-based financing provides the benefits of a quasi-equity, meaning that we're aligning growth with repayment in a predictable, non-extractive way. And then it also offers a structured exit path without forcing a sale or requiring IPOs. This makes our fund a fit for purpose mechanism in underserved contexts. And it's often misunderstood because it kind of sits between debt and equity. We don't charge interest rate. We're looking for a multiple. People are really trying to understand this as a tool. But for us, it's basically like our biggest hurdle is to make sure that it's understood enough and that it's celebrated as an in-between space, as a zone of innovation in the way we get capital to entrepreneurs here.
How does it work in practice? I mean, how do you structure this?
Yeah, so the way it works is basically what I call it is like pay as you grow, right? So entrepreneurs pay as a percentage of their revenues, typically between 5 and 8%, until they hit a cap, which usually sits, between 1.5 and 2x the original investment.
So you have a cap, and then once they hit that cap, then it's finished?
Yeah, we've exited and we celebrate. We have a big party.
When you hit that cap, you've exited and you have no further claim on the revenue.
That's right. That's it. Yeah. I mean, ideally by that time, because the way we're timing it, we'll already have a fund to capture the upside of that as well. But all the trust has already been built throughout the years, right? I mean, what I like about it is that this model gives founders some breathing room, right? Like if they grow quickly, they repay quickly. If they grow this slower, of course, we grow with them. But the timeline, we plan for repayments to be between 5 and 7 years. Some may pay back earlier, but we also have some flexibility kind of like baked in, right? 2 types of flexibility are there. One, of course, compared to a regular loan, our capital is flexible because it adapts to the regular sales cycles of the different entrepreneurs, right? So what is a staple product that comes from the Andean region? Cacao and quinoa, right? There are very specific times when cacao demand is higher around the year. Valentine's Day, I don't know, whatever, Christmas, whatever. Those revenues look like that throughout the year. So why would we have like a set payment for them with a set interest rate, regardless of how they're doing? We get a little bit closer to their cash flow, and it benefits them and it benefits us, of course, because we invest in companies that understand their cash flow really well. And if we ever find companies that are great but don't understand their cash flow, then we roll up our sleeves and we're like, here, we're going to teach you about cash flow 101 and what taking our money would mean for you in a day-to-day basis with your finance lead.
I understand from what you've told me the advantage that this revenue-based financing provides to your founders, but your upside is capped. The typical VC model is you let your winners run away, and some will fall off and not return, and some will just have mediocre or not spectacular return. In your case, you've got a cap on the upside, but your downside risk is identical to a typical VC.
We start seeing repayments month 6. In a typical VC setting, most companies in the portfolio are mediocre or fail, right? Like, and then you're hoping for, those top 2%, 3% winners, right? And you really have to have those happen for everything else to work out. In our case, at this point, with 8 companies in our portfolio, we have 100% repayment rate. Your losses are, at this point are going to be far lower because you start seeing money back almost immediately. When it comes to the VC, you have to wait until the very end to see who won.
You're really only investing in companies that are going to start spinning cash relatively quickly.
We actually transcend VC stages. There's like seed stage. Of course, we have to for the global audience tell you that we're kind of seed stage, but we're not. The companies that we investing are typically between 3 and 4 years old and already cash flow positive. So their growth trajectory, like we're not expecting any unicorns to come out of this. And everyone needs to know, LPs, companies, like if you're selling me you're going to become a unicorn, I will not invest in you. Thank you. Like I'll find you better capital for that. But in our case, we are looking for companies who have found product market fit, that have steady cash flow, and who are running up against the lack of capital as probably the main limitation to growth.
So they already have a demonstrable business model. The business model is already proven.
Yeah, clients, client bases, like more clients than they can serve. Maybe I can walk you through a couple of examples having talked about revenue-based finance because I think it makes more sense there, right? Okay, so maybe let's talk about Elsa. You had mentioned, how does this company make money, right? So actually, Elsa is really interesting because the story of the founder is probably the best way I can explain why this is such a good product market fit. So the founder is a Peruvian lawyer. She has, a lot of exposure to US law firms. She worked in a law firm and, she did all the trainings around sexual harassment from United States law firms, and this is right around the time when Me Too as a movement becomes, a real issue for a lot of corporate boards, companies large and small. And of course, businesses on that side for lawyers is booming. They have too many clients, So she learns from that. And then when she goes to work at a Peruvian law firm. She is that expert, but also realizes that culturally speaking, sexual harassment in the workplace in the United States, which is very much risk averse, you can't really touch anyone. In Latin America, doesn't fly. We hug a lot, in the workplace. Let's say that. So she had this challenge of kind of figuring out what does she take and what does she keep and how does she frame what sexual harassment in the workplace is meaning for Latin America. And it turns out that it took a long time for Me Too as a movement to grow in the United States. It took zero time for it to become a global issue, right? Social media, changing generations. And then it explodes throughout Latin America. And she sees this challenge of not being able to see enough people. And also the horrible part, because once a CEO or a board chair calls a lawyer with a case like this, it's already costing them money, but it's already talking about very real lives destroyed, right? So she was saying, how can I get to the other end of this? Because this is depressing, right? You have to get psychologists involved. There's suicides happening. This is horrible. So she started creating this method that allows companies to kind of be able to tell what their workplace culture is. And based on that, kind of predict whether, what the chances are that sexual harassment would happen in the workplace. And then brings in some technology, turns it into a SaaS platform. And then all of a sudden, bam, she has an incredible product that she can sell to larger companies that cannot possibly, for HR managers of companies that have 3 different factories in remote rural areas in Latin America, they cannot check on that, but they're still responsible for it. And it's going to cost them at least $100,000 to deal with one sexual harassment case, but they never come in once. Right? So they were thinking, okay, this has now become a workplace risk issue. How do we workplace mitigate? And her SaaS B2B platform is the way you mitigate. So companies buy a membership. They are able to constantly monitor workplace attitudes and culture throughout their different locations. So maybe corporate office is less, and then, the factory in the South is more. And then, the factory where there's a female leader is less, and they are able to make decisions around training and prevention and mitigation based exactly on that data. It's a great company. And because it's a B2B SaaS, her original plan was actually to go for VC funding, so that she can grow and become a unicorn and all these things. And then it was just at that time when interest rates dropped in the United States. And, VC funders started panicking and taking fewer risks. And to be fair, the VC circles are not as open to thinking about this as a great business model. So she was just like, okay, maybe I'll just change the trajectory of how I'm going to grow. I'm going to grow like a solid small and medium business that solves this problem. Her revenue is fantastic, is solid. The risk of it failing is I would say very little unless she started growing too fast. And her clients love it. She can actually tell you, the exact percentage. I don't have it in my mind. She'll tell you the exact percentage of sexual harassment cases that each company estimates that they have prevented. So yeah, great company, good problem, good solution.
Okay, what about Fibrazo?
Fibrazo is another business model. So these, again, we really believe in the founders because these are founders that have already worked on base of the pyramid challenges before. So what they do is they connect underserved communities to high-speed internet through a flexible contract-free prepaid model. So they operate in Colombia and Argentina, and they enhance digital inclusion, enabling thousands of households. At this point, probably hundreds of thousands of households to access essential online services and opportunities. And what they figured out is that geographically, you have Latin America has these mega cities, right? So when you think of Bogota, you're thinking probably of like the nice downtown with a nice fancy mall that has a McDonald's in front of it. But actually the vast majority of people in Bogota live in peripheral neighborhoods that are underserved, that barely have recently gotten access to running water, right? That's what's happening. Cartagena, you think of Cartagena, this beautiful beach destination, has some of the highest levels of poverty in their peripheral neighborhoods, incredibly unsafe for children, women to circulate anytime past 6 p.m. And on top of that, their access to internet is null. They don't have access to fiber internet the way you and I do. They might have 3G, but 3G access is very expensive and only works for cell phones and can't really run very sophisticated programs. Or you can't run, for example, an alarm system with a webcam through 3G, right? So they've done that. I was able to visit some of the neighborhoods last year. It was incredible because I was able to meet this woman who said the lifestyle change that having internet at home for her from this company meant everything, because before they came onto her neighborhood, she had, withdrawn all of her money from her monthly paycheck and had it on her. And then she was robbed at gunpoint and assaulted and beat up for that money. And then she had no money for a month. She's still paying that debt. And now she said, listen, now, because I have this, I have no need. I actually asked them to put the money into my bank account. I don't have the app on my phone because if my phone gets stolen, then the money goes out, and I can have it in my home and I can manage all of my payments online and I don't need to leave anymore. This grandmother was telling me that she had 2 grandchildren who were orphans, and she was like, I'm too old to be looking out for them. So I decided to, pay for them to learn English so that they stay at home and they don't go out and become part of gangs. So yeah, access to basic services as a right is a really good business as well. They have grown tremendously, and yes, they are a cash flow positive business.
And then maybe Sinba in Peru. It's informal waste collection, yeah?
Yeah, this is a really cool company as well. They are one of our circular economy companies. We have a few of those, and they convert waste into different resources. So what they do is they professionalize informal recyclers and encourage environmental responsibility with some households, but mostly businesses, right? So they actually are filling in the gap of what a regular waste management company in the United States or in Europe would do. That service doesn't exist in most cities in Latin America. And yet you have a lot of multinationals that have it as part of their ESG commitments. And what that means is they need these services to exist. What Simba does is they actually leverage the fact that there's already an informal waste picker kind of entire marketplace, basically, that is very underground, and it's horribly driven by, gangs and mafias and, exploitation. So what they've done is they actually have found these waste pickers that know exactly what they're doing in terms of dividing up waste, and then bring them into their company so that they can offer the services to all the multinationals that operate in Peru. And that has actually worked out really well because now they're expanding not just in Lima, but also in Arequipa, which is Peru's second largest city. Again, cash flow positive business, doing really well and really serving something that is not just the environmental aspect of it, which of course recycling is always wonderful, but the very human aspect. The conditions in which waste pickers live are probably the most inhumane conditions you could possibly imagine. And the fact that they're bringing those people and formalizing them and telling them, hey, your job is valued and appreciated and very rare, and we're going to compensate you at that level, right? So that's it. It's a beautiful way to tell a different story about waste management in Latin America.
The last one I wanted to ask you about was Cusi, an Ecuadorian superfood company.
Yeah, Yeah, so Kusi is it's actually one of the companies that where we always had in our hypothesis as like, what is the type of company you can fund in the Andean region? Which kind of company do we play with a natural competitive advantage? So in Ecuador, because Ecuador never had a civil war, we had a very associative rural areas, right? So when you have a civil war, the first people to go are the president of the Potato Association, right? That's true. Like, you look out for the leaders, and, war and violence, dissolves associativity. But Ecuador never had that. So it's very easy to find and connect and do business with associations. And associations are basically the foundation upon which you can do organic certifications, the foundation upon which you can do smallholder, farmer practices and improve seeds and all of these things. So what Kusi does is like they create these like minimally processed foods from Indian superfoods. So they do quinoa crackers and yuca cookies, and then you can make also just like gluten-free pancake mixes. And they have done really well with the Aloha's kind of like lifestyles of health and sustainability market, because it checks all the boxes. They really are minimally processed. I went to their factory and they were explaining the length to which they have gone to use a different type of to substitute like regular ingredients that would preserve and give their products a longer shelf life, to replace it with something that is actually more natural or more vitamin based and not as processed. So in terms of people that are really looking to eat very healthy foods, it's not enough that it says quinoa, because if when you turn it around and see all of these unknown ingredients, then you probably are eating great quinoa, but with very bad ingredients alongside it. These products actually differentiate themselves. And the way they grow, it's not necessarily through producing more or selling more, which of course they do, but also just by adding more value to the existing product as it is, right? So understanding that, there is a specific market that is willing to pay not one time more or two times more, but like 5 times more for food that is really truly clean, and that, so you can leverage all of these superfoods for that. We're really excited about them, and they're a terrific company. They just launched a new initiative with the Pachamama Foundation to make this Waorani Women Association, Indigenous women in the Amazon. They grow yucca in the ancestral way, where it's not a monoculture. They grow it within kind of like their own jungle forest of other fruits. They have made a commitment to source their yucca just from that. So it also has anti-deforestation initiative, within its own value chain. It would be very hard for a foreign company to try to set up something similar, and get it going with the same competitive advantage.
Interesting. What is your average ticket size for investments?
Yeah, our range is between $120,000 and $200,000. So ticket sizes are still small. Again, it's still our first fund. We need to get this first fund pilot out the door. But we're already seeing, that there will be, for fund 2, that there will be a lot of both demand and supply for larger ticket sizes for companies that are, that continue to grow at this pace.
What's the total AUM of your fund?
Our first fund is $2.1 million. And the way it works in terms of math, if you're wondering, okay, how does that work? We also have, we are housed within IMPAQTO, so we have minimum administration back office fees. And then we had a grant from the Inter-American Development Bank lab that basically bankrolled us into getting it going and paid for our analysts. So in that sense, even though we don't have any concessionary LPs in our fund, we are also blending finance to exist, right? So in that sense, we're very grateful that there are these partners that will actually see, the greater good of making sure that a fund like us does exist to unlock all of these other places.
Do you foresee that fund 2 will need concessionary backing or not?
That's a good question. I think it depends on what we decide to do with Fund 2. We've been talking to a couple of partners, and not necessarily about having a concessionary backing to get it going, but we've been discussing this figure of GP loans, because, in the end, somebody has to bankroll those initial, months to get it going before you actually can have a management fee out. So yeah, we're very curious to understand that a little bit more. Thinking maybe taking even 5 steps out. The impact investment world wants to see more emerging fund managers. They want to see more fund managers that are based in the geographies where they serve or where they operate. Because of course it's just better business. it represents people better. It's just better economics. I don't think anyone that's sitting in Miami could like do the same job we are doing, just, regardless of how incredibly talented they are, because they're not really standing here. So that if the ecosystem wants to support this, then we need to take a deeper look into the business model of what does it take to create a fund. Because to create a company, you already need, we've talked a lot about the inclusion or about the diversity of founders of startups, which is already hard. It's difficult. Yes, you need to, someone to bankroll you, somebody to, believe in you, give you some seed funding, which again is concessionary most of the time. But nobody's really looking at that like next level, up the pipeline, right? Of like how hard it really is. Like, unless you have a trust fund or like incredible savings or just a couple of uncles that really believe in you, it takes a good solid 2 years of, before you even have any money coming in to the management company. So because we are living now those growing pains, and we have an entire generation of other fund managers who see in us said, hey, we can do this too. Now we feel this responsibility to also start asking those questions a bit more publicly and say, hey, is it bad to have concessionary capital if that, to get a fund going, if that fund is going to leverage, I don't know, another $50 million into the impact economy? I think it's I couldn't think of a better business model, right? But yeah, I think we need to start thinking a little bit differently about what concessionary really means in this context and about all the benefits that concessionary capital can actually bring to ecosystems that haven't been quite developed yet, and can actually leapfrog a lot of the problems that developed ecosystems already have created by not questioning the system, right?
Your post-investment strategy goes beyond pure capital deployment. You provide what you call ecosystem leverage. Describe your value creation methodology and how you maximize both financial returns as well as social impact.
A couple of things to think about in those terms. One is that because Impacto and Impacto Capital is embedded into the broader ecosystem, we do have everyone that you can possibly need, 1 or 2 phone calls away. If you hit a problem, with, I don't know, with a provider, with a supplier, with a client, if you really want to reach a particular client that is growing, like we really can make those connections happen. And those happen all day, every day, throughout the year. It's just like, we're really one WhatsApp message away to make sure that we make those connections. That in itself is already quite useful. We also, in some of the cases, we participate on the board of the company, and that allows us to have of course, a closer look, but also just as we're looking at their growth trajectory, to be able to bring in advisors that might go deeper into things that sometimes have nothing to do with investment, but yes, with capital. So because we are always looking out for the cash flow of the company, for example, we had a deep dive with one of our companies about how to solve the problem of the lag between invoicing and getting paid the money in the bank. Things that are very specific, that are growing pains, because that means they are invoicing, right? And so we were able to bring, just like a couple of people that were experts, and we were able to say, okay, this is how you do it. This is how you negotiate your contracts. And once it was done, everything flourished. So those types of more informal opportunities that come out of being a part of the boards also help. But also, I think that more broadly, we think about it in terms of not just investing in companies, but investing in their context, right? Again, going beyond what the sheer spreadsheets say. Of course, I'm talking about spreadsheets as if they were lower. You don't understand. I think in spreadsheets. I review those spreadsheets. I look at the cash flow. I really understand how those work. But beyond that, what is the context? What is the broader context within which they operate, right? So if I start seeing that 2 or 3 of my portfolio companies that are in the ag business are hitting the same problem, because these are smaller countries, I can call the Ministry of Productivity and say, hey, look out. This is not my role, but I'm starting to see this as a trend. How can we solve this context for everyone? Because my portfolio companies are suffering it. And when an investor calls the public, people in the public sector, people listen. So we actually are leveraging that investor hat really well.
Impact measurement is one of the hardest challenges in the impact space. How do you actually define and measure success just beyond financial returns? What metrics genuinely matter to you versus maybe what people think should matter?
There are a number of things here. So we have decided to take the most pragmatic route in terms of impact measurement, not because it's less important, but because it costs a lot more if we want it to be even more rigorous and more deep, right? That doesn't mean that the impact is not there and seen. So when you were asking earlier about, what comes into the screens of our pipeline review, one of the most important screens earlier on is what we call the litmus test of a true impact business, right? So the question is, if this company grows, will its impact automatically grow? Or would it require a decision in the founder for the impact to grow? So it's the difference of a business model like Fibrazo, where if they're growing, that means they're reaching more people and there's more impact. And I don't know, like a Tom's Shoes type of like one, buy one, give one free, where it really is a decision, right? And because we make that decision earlier on, and every single company in our portfolio has impact embedded in the business model, then what we do is we have a conversation with the founder when we are bringing them on board. We negotiate and decide which are the most important impact indicators they want to measure and will be measuring. And then we track both, right? So if our assumption is right, that the more they grow, the more that indicator will grow, then we're always tracking that those two grow together when they report to us. If we see a significant variance between, in rate of growth between the two of them, then we know we need to start asking more questions. I know this is like, probably the lazy man's like way to assess impact and to have like checks and balances there, but it also makes sense. We've had companies in our pipeline that wouldn't consider themselves like quote unquote impact companies that are considering putting impact into their business model if we invest, that sort of thing. It hasn't happened yet, but when that happens, then we'll have to like think of a different layer of trust building there. But so far, every single founder in our portfolio would present themselves, first as an impact company. And that is one of the main reasons why the company exists. We'll have to see, like you're asking me about potential growing pains in the future. I should also probably mention that, we're openly and always knocking doors for people, or foundations that would be looking to maybe fund an actual rigorous impact study of our portfolio so that we can see what is happening, of course, correct course, but hopefully have a third party demonstrate, not just the impact of our companies, but also in the ecosystem of having an impact fund, in the region, because that will also like allow us to turn anecdotes into data. And so far within our business model, this study doesn't quite fit, but we know that in different ecosystems around the world, some foundations that really believe in that will actually fund the study and, find that, third party to verify.
You've spent over a decade building in what you call overlooked markets across the Andean region. What's the one thing about Latin American markets that global investors consistently get wrong that costs them in massive opportunity cost?
Global funders tend to misunderstand risk in the global south. When in more developed markets, you have people who turn spreadsheets into dreams. We actually tend to go the other way around. But that doesn't mean, the fact that the spreadsheet didn't come first doesn't mean that it's more risky. It's just probably even, more like lean way to build. So I would say, so those who don't understand, these emerging frontier markets, I would say, it's emerging markets don't lack innovation. What they lack is tailored trust.
What's the most important question that most investors never ask you that they absolutely should?
They should ask me more about examples of resilience within the entrepreneurs that are in our portfolio. I think that this is probably like subject for an entire new 2-hour podcast. But like I said, I think that the most important education I received is by observing and talking and listening and working alongside entrepreneurs that operate in super volatile markets and then just keep going. It's just this attitude of never bringing up a problem without at the same time remembering the incredible potential and love that we have for this territory. I wish investors would ask me for those anecdotes and be like, oh, wow, if you've survived that, take my money.
What's your strategy for convincing global philanthropy and institutional investors to back early stage overlooked founders in the Andean region? What's your elevator pitch for what they're overlooking and why should they pay attention to these smaller markets?
So I think it depends on what really matters to the philanthropist or to the investor, but it goes back to either avoiding a crisis or taking advantage of an overlooked opportunity. If I told an investor that is, that is used, investor in the global north that is used to very stable markets, real institutions, rule of law. And I told them, like, what would I tell you if I told you that the world's, a company that makes the world's best chocolate has operated for 25 years in a country like Ecuador, and has survived not just the pandemic, but rolling blackouts, indigenous uprising, the threat of mining, and can still turn a profit through regenerative agriculture. Doesn't that seem like the world is missing out on an incredibly great business opportunity to turn that money into not just, development for the Andean region, yes, but being the owner of an incredible company? So many people want to be wish they had been like an early investor in Patagonia because it's so nice and sexy and cool. There are 100 Patagonias here waiting to be funded that already have that ethos and that drive and that cult following. You can come and find them here. You don't want to miss out on that. And on the other hand, the Andean region is where the Amazonian headwaters are. So there would be no Amazon rainforest in Brazil if it wasn't because all of those above sky rivers hit the Andean region mountain range and then turn into this incredibly lush, humid ecosystem downstream that turns into the Amazon rainforest. Those are the lungs of the earth. And if we're losing the ecosystem of the Andean region to, silly things like, people who are in poverty have to cut down trees to sell them for fire. I mean, this seems something like that the private sector can solve, without having to go into like, don't cut the trees. No, it's about, I want to breathe good air sitting in London. So if you want that air, let's invest in a company over here that will give these people like a decent living, and they wouldn't have to cut down, ancient, beautiful, like 200-year-old trees for firewood, right? So there are these like inefficiencies that really drive people that come from the private sector. And like, oh yeah, you're actually absolutely right. Sign me up. I think that's what's really exciting about this region that probably makes it more difficult or more, in bigger markets like Mexico or Brazil, because there's so many other multiplicity of actors like multinationals and all these other things. Here, things are a little bit simpler,
You've learned some hard lessons about ecosystem building, and you've said that being open arms all the time as an ecosystem builder can actually destroy your mission. What do you mean by that?
When you're doing ecosystem building, you have to lead with trust first. Because when you lead with trust, then you build trust, and then you keep bringing on different allies and partners. So I think that, earlier on, I probably didn't have a fine-tuned ear to see red flags earlier on. And now I do. I think that, red flags around who you partner with have a lot to do with, the values of that partnership, what people are really looking for. And most importantly, having the difficult conversations up front, right? That's something actually I learned from the investment world. When you're talking about all the possibilities of what we can do together, the real truth comes when you have the difficult conversation of being like, okay, we talked about the everything goes good scenario. Now let's talk about the everything goes wrong scenario. Are you going to run for the hills? Or are you going to stick with me? And looking into someone's eyes and like really understanding what that would mean and the level of sacrifice that it would take for them to stick with the partnership, then you know who you're working with. The best lesson I learned, as I was building more and more partnerships was that the road to success is paved with difficult conversations. So the more difficult conversations you can have up front, the better things are going to go in the future.
And when you look them in the eye and ask them that, how do you know what type of person they are? By what they tell you or by what they don't tell you?
I present to them the real scenario. If this partnership doesn't go through or it goes south, are you willing to go back to your business partners and say, you need to go into debt to pay for this. Are you willing to do that? And if not, if that's going to be complicated, then let's stop talking now, So it's kind of like that knee-jerk reaction that somebody gets when they're presented with having to do something difficult. Most of the time, people are not ill-willed. Like, I still am, a pragmatic optimist. I think most of the time it's that, that people's ability to deal with discomfort makes them make poor decisions that are not aligned with their values, right? So presenting to them the absolute worst case scenario and observing, like, what does that do even to their body, does it make them sweat to just think, oh, I'm going to have to stand by my word? If that's going to be difficult, then maybe we shouldn't be working together, because that's not how we operate, right?
You left a successful career in Geneva, Switzerland. You sold everything and you moved back to Ecuador to start something that didn't even have a name yet. Looking back, was that decision genius or madness?
A little bit of both. I think it was a genius madness, because in the end, I'm happy that I was able to follow a non-rational voice in my head that was saying, you need to go home, right? Like that there's something about being home that allows me to be playing on the field where I can win. Now I can put words to it. But back then it was just kind of this, like, there's something calling me, right? So it could be madness initially, but now I can actually put words to it. And it's actually, genius, because in the end, so many things about people's careers, and of course, like, building like what is called a happy life is about being able to be in the place where your genius is appreciated and where your life experience and your networks and your understanding of where you're standing, is compensated not just by the market, but also by your community in terms of trust. That's the way one ought to live, right? And, and I think, you could, some other people call it in more esoteric terms. It's like, oh, the land was calling me. Yes, that too. And, in economic terms, in terms of like business strategy, if you will, if, I was like creating the business model of my life, then of course it also makes sense, because there are such few people that have access to this world level education that come back to the place where they understand best. And, there's this like broader story of the brain drain and people that leave and never come back. And then there's all these other things. I think that is a missed opportunity, not for the country. The country goes on, right? It's actually a missed opportunity for those people who are missing that chance to leverage all that new knowledge they have, but also all the original knowledge they had, things that they know deeply in their hearts because that's where they grew up.
You've said that entrepreneurial loneliness is a crisis that nobody talks about. Why is that? And what's the cost of ignoring it?
Well, I think that entrepreneurial loneliness is a problem because of the culture that we have to build around it, right? And actually has a direct link with the type of capital that we bring, right? So when you are a founder that receives venture capital, and if, let's say you've done really well, so you're one of those 2% possible winners in that portfolio, you have on your shoulders the responsibility of winning for yourself, for your team that you've brought in, to follow this bigger dream, but also that of all of these investors who are counting on you to be the winning horse. There is certain ecosystemic cultures leave no room for flinching. They leave no room for taking downtime, leave no room for vulnerability, which is the door that opens growth. So if you're not being allowed to be vulnerable, take downtime, say, I don't know, then how on earth do you grow? And growth is what drives humanity. If you're not growing and you're placing your growth with adulations and a peer company that says you're great and, seeking out board members that will never say no to you, then you end up having a crisis of mental health within the startup world that is pandemic levels of mental health issues. You have suicides. You have people who end up, and in the end, all of this, of course, we do care about humans, so we don't want that. But, with an investor's hat on, I cannot think of a riskier business. The spreadsheets could say, exponential growth forever. But if the CEO burns out and throws everything out the top floor window, then that's risk that you probably could have accounted for ahead of time, and there goes your winning horse, right? So in the end, it's not good business either. I think that paying attention not just to the loneliness of the entrepreneurs, but also the context that creates that loneliness and the deeper aspects of mental health and inner well-being, you want to call it whatever, right, would actually make for better business decisions, but also better investment decisions and management overall in the ecosystem.
You have an analogy that I love. You say that an ecosystem is like a wild plant, not like a plastic bucket. Explain this to me.
It's sometimes hard to grasp, right? Because when you want to build an ecosystem, you're like, okay, what is missing? Let's find, a few potted plants and then create an irrigation system where we have the best water and the best nutrients. And then these potted plants will grow to be the absolute best. And we're going to, and of course, that's how an engineer would approach it, right? So I know engineers, they're all in my family. So that's how an engineer would approach it. And it makes sense. Humans have this need to be able to control everything to ensure that their output, a very tall, growing, beautiful plant will give them their return. But that's not how the world works, one. And two, it's a system that it's very fragile, because all it takes is for, the irrigation system to have one problem and for your supplier of the irrigation system to break, to not arrive to change it, for the entire thing to fall apart. But when you actually talk about like a wild plant or a wild forest, if you observe nature, the most resilient forests, of course, the Amazon rainforest, which I get to see, they do not stop. They grow taller than any potted plant out there. No human is taking care of them. It's because they've devised all of these systems that are known and unknown to the human eye to be able to be resilient. So when one of these trees falls, it becomes food and mycelium for all the other trees to grow over. And it becomes the home for ants, and those ants bring this, and animals bring this other thing. So it's almost like there is an art and there's a science to ecosystem building. And of course, there's some science to it. But I would say if you want a resilient ecosystem, it will take patience and a lot of art, a lot of really observing what is it in nature that we can replicate, for our ecosystem, for things to actually work in the long term, right?
Has this type of mindset changed how you work with partners who maybe have let you down before? Do you give people second and third chances based on this idea that everyone is still growing?
Yeah, actually, yeah. I think that's, maybe I wouldn't have said the same thing 5 years ago, but maybe there's something about, actually drinking that Kool-Aid that has made me open doors again, giving people, not just a second chance, but also the opportunity to have second reactions too. It used to be that, I would try something and people would be like, oh no, but this is not my thing, blah, blah, blah. So I'd be like, okay, that door's closed forever. And I'm thinking, okay, but not everyone has to have a first brilliant wow reaction to what you're doing. Let's give them a chance to have a second reaction. Maybe it doesn't have to be me talking about that. Maybe they have to observe it. Maybe they have to feel it. Maybe they have to hear about it. So yeah, definitely.
Michelle, I've got a few rapid fire questions for you before we wrap up. Don't overthink these and just give me whatever comes to your mind, or if nothing does, feel free to take a pass. That's okay too. But if you had to name the single most important structural barrier to gender equity in investing in Latin America, what would that be?
Two sides of the same coin. And this coin is who decides what leadership actually looks like, and then also who funds it.
If you could wave a wand and fix one thing in the impact investing world, what would that be?
I would disappear extractive due diligence and maybe replace it with more relational trust building, add more trust building to every due diligence deal.
What's something that you believed as recently as 5 years ago about impact investing that you've changed your mind about since then?
I started off thinking that patience is a virtue, and you have to be patient and let people think. And now I'm starting to change my mind more towards thinking about urgency having its own type of wisdom, right? Sometimes when you have urgency, you let not the brain intelligence lead, but more other types of intelligences like your body, your intuition. And I like what urgency does to that.
What's the single most important piece of advice you would give to a young woman starting a social venture in Quito right now?
Don't feel like you have to grow apologizing for who you are.
Name one book, one habit, and one personal ritual that you couldn't live without.
A book I am currently enjoying, Becoming a Matriarch. It's a memoir by Helen Knott. The title attracted me because my grandmother passed away this year, and there was this question about being, what does it mean to be a matriarch, and how does power expresses itself different, and as a mother versus as a father. So I'm enjoying that. My habit is that I always walk while I talk. I think that clarity follows motion, and I most often cannot think on my own or think writing. But if I'm walking, that's when my best ideas come out. And
this must be torture for you today.
I feel like I had real walking. And then a ritual is something that, I've done on and off throughout the years, but starting team meetings or even partnership meetings with a checking on people's well-being, like how are you standing today? How are you showing up today? I think that sometimes a question as simple as that can make people realize that they have agency over how they show up in a meeting.
Michelle, this has been fascinating for me. Your journey from being a human rights lawyer to ecosystem building and then onto impact investing is really so compelling. And the way you're reshaping capital flows in Latin America is really impressive. So I want to thank you for taking the time to do a deep dive with me today. I've really learned a lot.
Oh, thank you, Scott. I also learned a lot from your questions, and thank you for entertaining so many details as well. I really appreciate how human this conversation has been.
So before we wrap up, tell everyone where they can learn more about IMPAQTO Capital and connect with all the great work that you guys are doing.
That would be our website, impactocapital.com. That's Impacto with a Q, IMPAQTO capital.com.
And what's the best way for people to reach out to you directly?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I think it's one of my most important tools for ecosystem building, so I'm always happy to connect.
Everyone should definitely check out impactocapital.com. That's Impacto with a Q, where normally there would be a C. And that's for the investment work. And I think impacto.net is the website of your broader ecosystem
building company. That's right.
That could be very interesting. Well, okay, Michelle, thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much, Scott. Have a great day.
Okay, thanks again. Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact, all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.